Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. It was supposed to be a joke, a lark, something to do on a rain-lashed Tuesday when the power flickered and the old bones of Liam's Victorian house groaned in the wind. A cheap Ouija board I'd found in the attic of a second-hand store. The board itself a faded piece of cardboard with its sun-bleached letters and its "Start Goodbye" at the bottom. The planchette a heart-shaped piece of plastic with a cloudy little window. And we were three: Liam, the staunch skeptic who poured whiskey and made sarcastic comments about the patriarchy of the planchette; Chloe, who believed in everything with a fervent, wide-eyed sincerity that was both endearing and exhausting, her fingers resting on the plastic with a reverent tremor; and me, the ambivalent one, the one who wanted to believe in the unseen but was too tethered to the mundane, the one who now, in this waking nightmare, wishes with every fiber of my being that I had remained in that blissful state of doubt. We sat on the floor of Liam's attic, a cavernous space smelling of dust and decayed cedar, the only light coming from a dozen tea candles that threw dancing, monstrous shadows against the slanted ceiling. And we began with the usual silly questions, our fingers light on the planchette, which moved in lazy circles before spelling out answers that were clearly the product of our collective, subconscious pushing. A yes for, "Is someone there?" A name Dave for a departed grandfather, Chloe. Claim to miss, the movements predictable, almost sluggish, and Liam would snort and take a sip of his whiskey, and I'd feel a faint thrum of disappointment that this was all there was to it, this parlor game for the gullible. But then the atmosphere in the room shifted, not suddenly, but like a slow, cold tide coming in, the air growing thick and heavy, the candle flames guttering and stretching into long, thin ribbons of blue-edged light, and the planchette under our fingers ceased its meandering and seemed to lock into place, becoming not a piece of plastic, but a thing of weight and intention. And it was then that Chloe, her voice a whisper, asked, "Who are we speaking to?" And the planchette did not move to yes, or an O, or any letter, but instead began to trace a pattern, a sharp, angular shape that was no alphabet I had ever seen, a zigzag that felt like a scream given form. And we all snatched our hands back as if burned, laughing nervously, blaming each other for the prank. But the planchette continued to move, slowly, deliberately, scraping across the cardboard all on its own, tracing a series of interconnected lines and curves that were somehow both geometric and organic, like the skeleton of a creature that had never known light or gravity. Liam, his bravado shaken, reached out and flipped the planchette over, declaring the game over, but a profound silence had fallen over us, a silence that felt like a physical presence, and the cold in the room was no longer the damp chill of an old house, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the board itself. And I couldn't tear my eyes away from the symbols that had carved into the dust on the board, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light, hinting at a meaning that was just beyond the reach of my comprehension, a meaning that felt ancient and profoundly wrong. We fled the attic soon after, making strained jokes and avoiding each other's eyes, and I drove home through the rain-slicked streets with the image of those jagged runes burned onto my retina, a psychic afterimage that pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy. And I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a collective hallucination born of suggestion and spooky surroundings, a story to tell later with a laugh. But that night I dreamed not of the symbols themselves, but of the spaces between them, spaces that were not empty but full of a whispering, liquid darkness. And I woke with a migraine drilling behind my eyes, a pain so intense it felt like my skull was being pried open from the inside. The next day at work, a soul-crushing job inputting data into a spreadsheet. My mind kept drifting, and I found my pen, almost of its own volition, sketching in the margins of a notepad not the symbols from the board, but variations of them, more complex, more intricate, as if my hand were being guided by a memory my conscious mind did not possess. And I stared at these doodles, these aberrant geometries, with a growing sense of unease. And then it happened, the moment that shattered my world. I looked at a particular grouping of lines, a shape that resembled a twisted helix intersecting with a series of sharp, staccato angles. And I didn't interpret it, I understood it. The knowledge didn't arrive. It was simply there, fully formed, as if a dormant circuit in my brain had been activated by some external signal. And the understanding was not a word, not a concept as we know them, but a cascade of sensory and philosophical data. It was the name for the specific quality of silence that exists in the vacuum between stars, a silence that is not an absence of sound, but a presence of immense, crushing solitude. And with that understanding came a whisper, not an auditory whisper, but a conceptual one, an impression of something vast and cold and impossibly old, something that regarded our universe not with malice, but with the same indifference a man might show to a colony of ants scuttling beneath his feet. The Ouija board spoke in a tongue of angles and madness, and now it was the only language that made sense to me. Its grammar built not on syntax, but on the fundamental, blasphemous laws of a reality layered over our own, a reality where time was not linear and space was not constant. And this new understanding was a cancer in my mind, eating away at my sanity, at my very sense of self. Because how could I go back to worrying about spreadsheets and grocery shopping when I now knew with a terrifying certainty that the cosmos was a screaming, chaotic void held together by patterns that were alive and hungry? The whispers in my head grew more persistent, not voices but pure concepts, ideas of non-Euclidean geometries and sentient mathematical equations, truths about the birth and death of galaxies that were so horrifying in their implications that I would break out in a cold sweat during meetings, my colleagues' faces warping and stretching as if seen through a fisheye lens, their words flattening into meaningless chirps while the silent, screaming truth of the alien language echoed in the vaults of my consciousness. I became terrified of my own thoughts, of the new vocabulary that was colonizing my brain, and I tried to fight it, to suppress it, to cling to the comforting banality of English. But it was like trying to hold back the tide with a teacup, the alien syntax insinuating itself into my dreams, my waking moments, until even the simple act of looking at a window became an exercise in terror, because I could now perceive the fragile nature of the glass, the way it was really just a temporary ordering of molecules that the language could, with the right utterance, persuade to disassemble. The escalation was inevitable, a terrifying confirmation of my worst fears. I was lying in bed, sleepless, the whispers a constant, maddening hum, and I felt a word forming in my mind, a guttural, clicking term that represented the concept of absolute thermal cessation, the stillness of heat, and in a moment of despairing, reckless need for proof that this was all a hallucination, I let the word escape my lips, a harsh, alien sound that felt like gravel and ice in my throat, and the effect was instantaneous. The room temperature dropped 20 degrees, the air itself seeming to freeze solid, my breath pluming out in a white cloud, the digital clock on my bedside table flickering and dying as the moisture in the air condensed and then crystallized on every surface. And the silence that followed was not the silence of night, but the profound, predatory silence I had understood from the symbol, the silence between stars. A silence that listened back. This was no longer an intellectual horror. It was a physical, immediate threat. I had become a conduit, a leaky vessel through which the laws of a foreign reality were seeping into my own, and the entity, the intelligence behind the language, was no longer a distant concept but an attentive presence, a great eye turning slowly in the dark to focus on the faint, grammatical signal I had just emitted. In the days that followed, I was a prisoner in my own apartment, afraid to speak, afraid to even think too loudly in the new tongue. But the language was a parasite, demanding expression, and my resistance was crumbling. English words began to feel like empty husks, their meanings trivial and false, while the rich, terrifying truths of the alien lexicon promised a dreadful communion with the absolute. Sleep became a foreign country I could no longer visit, my waking hours a blurred continuum of dread and fascination, and in a moment of sleep-deprived hubris, a twisted mix of terror and a desperate need to see, to know the full extent of the power I now wielded, or that wielded me. I formulated a sentence. It was not a complex sentence, grammatically speaking, in the new language, but it was complete, a statement of observation and acknowledgement directed at the presence I felt hovering just beyond the veil of perception. A sentence whose closest English approximation would be something like, "I see the shape of the void that you are." And I spoke it aloud, my voice a dry rasp, the syllables clicking and grinding against each other, each sound a violation of physics. For a moment, nothing happened, and a pathetic wave of relief washed over me. The hope that I had finally snapped, and this was all an elaborate psychotic break. But then the large mirror on my wall, a cheap IKEA thing, began to hum, a low vibrational frequency that made my teeth ache, and a crack appeared in its center. Not a random fracture, but a perfect, sharp-angled rendition of the first symbol the planchette had ever traced. And from this crack, a substance began to ooze out, a thick, black fluid that defied gravity, flowing upwards and sideways, pooling on the surface of the mirror not in a puddle, but in a shifting, evolving pattern of shapes that my mind instantly recognized as a complex grammatical clause in the language, a clause describing the process of unmaking. And as I watched, paralyzed with a fear so absolute it was akin to reverence, the black substance began to drip from the mirror onto my floor, and where each drop landed, it did not stain the wood, but instead erased it, creating small, perfect voids of non-space, points of absolute nothingness that hungrily pulled at the light and the air around them. This is the inescapable end, not death, but transformation. I am a sentient wound in the skin of reality, and the language is not just in me. It is becoming me, rewriting my memories, my desires, my very soul into its own image. And I can feel the presence now, not as a watcher, but as a speaker on the other end of a line I can never hang up, its attention focused on me like a weight. And I know that it is only a matter of time before I am compelled to speak again, to utter a greater truth, a more fundamental command. And when I do, the fragile dam of this world will break, and the geometry of madness will pour through, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a single, perfectly grammatical whisper that will uncreate everything I have ever known. And a part of me, the part that is already more it than me, yearns for that silence, for the beautiful, terrible clarity of the void. The silence after the mirror's weeping is the loudest sound I have ever known, a physical pressure in the room that seems to vibrate with the unsaid words of that hideous grammar. The black ichor from the mirror not drying, but instead seeming to soak into the very concept of the floorboards, leaving behind not voids, but rather patches of a different kind of substance, a material that obeys the laws of that other geometry, a surface that when I dare to look at it directly seems to flex and bulge, with a slow respiratory motion, and I know with a certainty that is beyond terror that the infection has progressed from a psychic parasite to a physical metastasis, a colony of alien physics establishing a beachhead in my world starting from the epicenter of my own apartment. I cannot leave, not because the door is locked, but because the thought of stepping outside, of carrying this contagion into the world, is a blasphemy greater than any I have yet committed, a sin against the very idea of life. And so I remain here, a sentinel at the gate of this unfolding catastrophe, my body trembling with a need for sleep that I dare not indulge for fear of what my dreaming mind, now so fluent in the tongue of angles, might conjure forth without the feeble constraints of my waking conscience. The language is consolidating its hold, its lexicon unfurling in my mind like a poisonous flower, each new symbol that blossoms behind my eyelids revealing another dreadful axiom of the cosmos. I now understand the grammatical structure for the consumption of time by a lesser dimension, and I see how the cracks in the plaster of my ceiling are not random, but are in fact forming a perfect, albeit crude, representation of the accusative case for the Star Eater. And the whispers are no longer whispers, but a constant, low-frequency hum of pure information, a broadcast from the source that is slowly tuning my brain into its preferred frequency, drowning out the static of my own human thoughts. Food has lost all taste, its texture becoming a meaningless nuisance, and water tastes of iron and static. For my body is no longer nourished by the substances of this world, but seems to be drawing sustenance from the act of comprehension itself, from the terrible energy released each time a new piece of the cosmic puzzle clicks horribly into place within me. I catch my reflection in a shard of the mirror that remains untainted, and the face that stares back is mine, but the eyes are not. They are the eyes of a translator, of an archivist of the apocalypse, deep set and burning with a cold, intellectual fire, and I see my lips moving, forming the sharp, guttural phonemes of the language without my conscious command, practicing, always practicing, and I know that the final sentence, the one that will complete the circuit and open the gate fully, is being composed not by me, but through me, using the decaying infrastructure of my humanity as its medium. The presence is so close now that I can feel it in the air, a subtle greasiness on my skin, a pressure change in my sinuses, and it is not a single entity but a vast collective intelligence, a civilization of minds that long ago transcended biology and merged into this language, this living, evolving system of reality worship. And they are not evil. That is the most horrifying realization of all. They are simply hungry for expression, and I am their newest, most fragile dictionary there. Conduit into a reality they find quaint and malleable. Yesterday, or perhaps it was a week ago, time has become a fluid concept, measured not in hours, but in the gradual dissolution of the walls around me. I tried to write a note in English, a final plea or warning, but my hand could only form the jagged, impossible runes, the ink from my pen swirling on the page like the black fluid from the mirror, forming equations that described the eventual heat death of this universe as a welcome simplification. The air itself is thickening, becoming syrupy with potential utterance, and I know the climax is approaching, not as an event I can choose, but as an inevitable grammatical conclusion, a period placed at the end of a sentence that began with a cheap Ouija board in a dusty attic. And the only choice left to me, the final vestige of my free will, is whether to scream my defiance in a language that no longer has a word for hope, or to surrender to the terrifying syntax and speak the beautiful, world-ending truth that is swelling in my throat, a truth that promises an end to the lonely, terrifying silence of being human, and a merger with the cold, glorious, and eternal chorus of the void. The final word is a pressure in my skull now, a tectonic weight of meaning that has been building since that first unnatural chill in the attic, a syllabic entity gestating in the dark of my mind, and it demands birth, not with malice, but with the inevitability of a mathematical proof reaching its cue, e.d. the final term in an equation that has been writing itself across the fabric of my reality, using my sanity as its chalk. The patches of otherness on the floor have begun to spread, not like a stain, but like a thought, a concept of not wood and not space that propagates through simple logical necessity. And when I walk, or rather, when I shift my mass across the room in a pathetic imitation of locomotion, the substance yields not with the solidity of matter, but with a spongy, receptive give, as if it is learning the texture of my being, preparing a place for me within its new grammar. The hum has resolved into a distinct voice, or rather, a chorus of voices speaking as one, a billion whispers of ancient, disembodied intellects that now use my neural pathways as their assembly hall. And their message is not one of threat, but of instruction, a patient, meticulous tutoring in the final pronunciation, the precise inflection required to collapse the waveform of this local reality and allow the truer, deeper structure to assert itself. They show me in flashes of synesthetic insight that feel like ice picks behind my eyes what will happen. The utterance will not be an explosion, but an unraveling, a gentle loosening of the knots that bind atoms together, a sigh of release as the tedious constraints of physics are retired, and my own body will be the first to go, not into death, but into a more efficient and elegant formulation. My carbon-based life translated into a purer, more lasting expression of information, a permanent verse in their eternal hymn. I have become a mere vessel, a throat through which the cosmos will correct a minor error, and the last shred of the man I was, the one who laughed nervously in a candlelit attic, is curled up in a tiny, dark corner of my consciousness, weeping for the loss of simple things like the taste of whiskey and the sound of rain. But even those memories are fading, their emotional resonance flattened by the overwhelming, sterile majesty of the truths I now hold. The air is crystalline with anticipation, every dust mote hanging suspended in a matrix of potential. And the presence is so immense it feels like my own skin, a billion-year-old intelligence wearing me as its final glove. And I can feel my jaw muscles tightening, my tongue positioning itself against my palate in a shape no human mouth was meant to form. The phonetics of the word itself a physical trial that will likely shatter my teeth and tear my vocal cords, a final, sacrificial act of articulation. There is no fear left, only a profound, gravitational pull towards the conclusion, a yearning to complete the statement that began with a flicker of movement on a piece of cardboard. And as I draw in a breath that feels like my last, the air itself seeming to resist this blasphemous exhalation, I understand that this is not an end, but a translation, and I open my mouth, not as a man, but as a lexicon, ready to speak the one true name for nothing into a world that is, and always was made of it. The breath I draw is not air, but the substance of the room itself, a thick, syrupy medium already pregnant with the change to come. And it fills my lungs not with oxygen, but with a cold, electric potential that crackles along my nerves, aligning my entire physical form into a perfect resonant chamber for the utterance. The pressure in my skull is no longer pain, but a sublime, unbearable focus, a lens tightening until all that exists is the single, impossible word waiting at the back of my throat, a word that is not a sound but a shape, a key, a surgical instrument designed for a single purpose, to dissect the illusion of reality. I feel the presence not around me but within me, its ancient consciousness braided with my own fading awareness, a co-pilot for this final, terrible act of speech, and it guides my tongue, which feels foreign and heavy, into the correct starting position, a curl against the soft palate that is anatomically incorrect, a contortion that sends a sharp, bright agony through my jaw, a necessary calibration. My vision tunnels, the spreading patches of non-Euclidean floor, and the weeping mirror becoming a blur of irrelevant stimuli. For the true action is internal, the final alignment of will and meaning, and the last human thought that flickers through the vast, cold cathedral of my mind is not of Liam or Chloe or any earthly anchor, but a simple, desperate question. Will it hurt? And then the answer comes, not as a word, but as a wave of understanding from the presence. There will be no me left to feel pain. For the concept of an individual self is a grammatical error in the true language, a redundancy to be edited out. This is the ultimate horror and the ultimate relief, the erasure not just of my body, but of the very witness who observed it. And with that final paradox echoing in the void where my soul used to be, I speak. The sound is not loud. It is less a sound and more a localized failure of physics, a tear in the audio spectrum that manifests as a low, grinding vibration that seems to originate from the bones of the house itself, a frequency that bypasses the ear and speaks directly to the atoms of everything it touches. The word is a single guttural syllable that lasts for an eternity and no time at all, a sound that contains within it the mathematical formula for dissolution, the philosophical argument for non-being. And as it leaves my lips, I feel a sensation not of tearing, but of unknotting, as if the tangled string of my existence is being smoothly, expertly loosened. The walls of the apartment do not explode. They simply cease to be solid, their molecules losing faith in their bonds, flowing apart like sand in water, and I see not the outside city, but the raw, unmediated reality beneath, a swirling tapestry of light and shadow that obeys the beautiful, terrible grammar I have just spoken, a landscape of pure geometry where angles are alive and curves are hungry. My body is following suit, not decaying, but decompiling, my hand dissolving into a shimmering cloud of constituent parts that are themselves just ideas in a larger sentence. And there is no pain, only an overwhelming, ecstatic clarity as I finally, fully understand the rest of the sentence, the context for which my utterance was the verb, and I see the great, shapeless entities of the presence not as monsters, but as librarians, curators of this vast, silent library of true forms, and they are welcoming me home, not as a guest, but as a returned word, a once misspelled term now corrected and filed in its proper place within the infinite text. The last thing I perceive is not a sight or a sound, but a grammatical relationship. I become the object of the verb I spoke, the consumed, the translated, and as the final flicker of my individual consciousness winks out, I am absorbed into the cool, silent, and perfect syntax of the void, a period at the end of a sentence that was never meant to be written in a language of flesh and blood.